individual health, but also the health of the planet. Next slide. So through research, education, policy, and practice, we address some of the many profound impacts of food systems on public health, ecosystems, and social justice. Some of our areas of focus include food animal production, climate, food equity, policy, diet health and planetary boundaries, food waste, seafood resilience, and we also engage with Baltimore through a variety of initiatives and projects. So you're only going to hear a small fraction of this work today in our 4 lightning talks, but we'll share with you at the end some additional ways that you can get engaged on these issues if you're interested. So before we jump in, a few quick housekeeping notes. 1, everyone's microphones are muted except for the panelists that are presenting. If you have questions, we're going to have a Q&A session for about 15 minutes at the end. So you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and submit questions for the panelists. And for flow, I will introduce each speaker as we're transitioning slides between each talk. Okay? Anything else? Panelists? No? Okay, so let's get started. We're going to start with Kiev. Dr. Kiev Nachman is an associate professor of environmental health and engineering at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He holds a triple crown of degrees from Hopkins. He's the co-director of the Risk Sciences and Public Policy Institute and the director of CLF's Food Production and Public Health Program. Dr. Nachman's research focuses the application of risk sciences to decision-making in the context of diet, drinking water, soils and dust, and other human exposure contexts. He has published on an array of environmental health topics, including food and waterborne chemical and microbiological hazards, epidemiologic investigations of agricultural communities, soil exposure factors, and the use of epidemiology and risk assessment. Kiev, take it away.
All right, Pam, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here speaking to Hopkins alums. I don't think I've done an alum talk before, so it's kind of great to come back and speak to a crowd that I'm part of. But anyway, I'm going to be talking about the role of food and agriculture in planetary health today, drawing on some of the research that I and my team has been doing at CLF over the last couple of years. So climate change is really among one of the greatest public health, ecological, and economic threats of our generation and for many generations to come. And we've all heard the horrors of what climate change has in store for us if we don't act. And those things include flooding, droughts, heat waves, wildfires. We're seeing a lot of these things happen right now, extreme hydrological events. And these things add up to a really immeasurable burden of morbidity and mortality and economic damage. So there are lots of things that human beings do that contribute to the release of greenhouse gases into the environment that influence climate change. I'm going to talk about livestock and agriculture today, which account for a very large share of global greenhouse gas emissions coming from humans. It's estimated that globally the livestock sector is responsible for about 14% of human origin greenhouse gas emissions. And it's on par with, as you can see, the transportation sector. And so if you want to take that 14% and break it out, it's attributable to a lot of different factors within agriculture. Things like methane from cattle burps, manure, decomposition, nitrous oxide arising from that process, as well as the use of fertilizer on crops and pastures. So many agricultural activities contribute substantially to our greenhouse gas burden. And what's important to keep in mind is that not all foods are created equal when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. And so what this figure is a comparison across different types of foods of the kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per serving for different foods. So you can see on the right side, we have terrestrial animal products or terrestrial meats. And animal products in general, going from dairy and eggs to aquatic animals to terrestrial meats, tend, relative to plant foods, to contribute far more per serving in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So what we eat tends to matter to a great extent in terms of our contribution to climate change. And what's also important about these meats is that where those foods are produced and the production methods that go into growing a pound of beef, for example, can have a dramatic influence on the overall contribution of that pound of food to greenhouse gas emissions. And so the data that I'm going to show you today are from a recent publication that you can see the citation for here on the bottom right, where we looked at the contributions of the diets of 140 countries around the world to the release of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so a couple of other points. There are some very climate-friendly animal products that I think are worth pointing out. And those things include, even though this may sound unpalatable to many of you, edible insects, bivalve mollusks like oysters, and low food chain fish like sardines. And so that's important to keep in mind as I move along to the subsequent slides. Okay, so where do we need to be when it comes to climate? So I showed you there's a lot of variability across food types in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but I haven't related those to our targets. So according to the Paris Agreement, there was a consensus that we need to be below 2 degrees centigrade in terms of global average or temperature rise to avoid catastrophic climate change consequences. And ideally, the science is moving us in the direction to think that we actually need to be below 1.5 degrees centigrade. So that doesn't leave us a whole lot of room. But maybe that doesn't by itself give you a clear sense of where we are now and where we're going. So I wanted to show you some emissions modeling scenarios to try and put things a little bit better in context. So if you look at this bar on the left here, the vertical axis is gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. And you can see that industry, transport, buildings, energy, all the non-food production related sectors contribute quite substantially to emissions, but agriculture itself contributes a substantial portion of greenhouse gas emissions from human activities. So that's 2010. But as countries become wealthier, what people eat tends to change and tends to include more animal products. So if we were to estimate what agriculture's emissions might look like in 2050, if we were to continue the trajectory that we're on now with regard to dietary patterns, it's anticipated that the agricultural contribution will nearly double. Right? So what does that mean in terms of meeting our climate change objectives? So this red dashed line that you see on the figure is a representation of where we need to be with greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 if we want to have a 66% chance of keeping global warming less than 2 degrees centigrade. And you might be wondering, where's the lighter bar in this? Well, this assumes if we're on the same agricultural trajectory that we completely decarbonize industry, transport, buildings, and energy by 2050, which is a major assumption. Certainly something we aspire to, but what this says to me, and hopefully says to you, is that we need to curb our agricultural contributions to climate change, and we need to start working on that now. A number of different interventions have been proposed and the effects of those have been modeled. So it's been modeled that if we reduce meat and dairy by 75%, we save about 7.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions. And if then we pile on top of that a 50% reduction in food waste, that gets us another 4.5 gigatons. But it's still an ambitious goal, and we need to think about starting to mobilize these interventions in actual practice. So the messages that I'm sharing with you today have been reinforced and amplified throughout the scientific literature. This is not news, hopefully, to any of you. This is well established. We need to reduce our meat and dairy intake if we have any hope of meeting our climate change mitigation targets. The real question, though, is how do we do it? What does it look like in practice? So CLF, I mentioned this before, published a paper recently where we looked at dietary patterns and their contribution to climate change across 140 countries around the world. And what we did is we modeled what things look like now, or the baseline scenario. And then we looked at 9 progressively plant-forward diets where we start substituting out animal protein for plant-based proteins or alternative proteins progressively to see what those would look like in terms of the per capita contribution or per person contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. So let me just explain what this figure is trying to represent. On the vertical axis, we have the per person kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. Each of the bars in the figure represents a different dietary scenario that's labeled along the horizontal axis, and the different colors that are represented correspond to different types of foods. The LUC abbreviation corresponds to land use change, meaning that if we are cutting down trees or removing forests in order to create land for animals to graze or to create land to grow food for animals, that's factored into the carbon dioxide footprints of these diets. But what you can see here are a couple of interesting things. So if you look at the vegan diet all the way on the right, you can see that scaling up plant foods to replace meat, dairy, eggs, and fish recouped about 100% of kilocalories and about 63% of protein with only 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So vegan diets are a pretty ambitious change, but the greenhouse gas returns are immense. But what is really interesting is there's some other more incremental dietary changes, some more gentle transitions that are also going to give us really amazing greenhouse gas returns. So this diet that we call 2/3 vegan, which means we take the diet we eat now and we take 2 of the meals and make them vegan, we leave the 3rd meal the same. So you don't have to permanently cut out any food, which is pretty big. That 2/3 vegan diet actually gives better climate returns than a lacto-ovo or a milk and dairy vegetarian diet. This breaks down a dietary change barrier for a lot of people. I think many folks would have issues with completely eliminating a food, but what our model shows is that any food can continue to remain in the diet, and the modulation of the amount of that food could still allow us to achieve some pretty ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals and still allow you to have that special food once in a while. The 2050 target that I'm going to show you right now is the threshold for food system greenhouse gas emissions as recommended by the Eat Lancet Commission, who's a really credible body trying to help us get where we need to go with mitigation. Unfortunately, and this is kind of a sobering wake-up call, only 2 of the diets as currently modeled kept us below that target. The low food chain diet, which includes some insects and mollusks, but otherwise is a vegan diet, and the vegan diet. So, that doesn't mean that everyone has to shift immediately to a vegan diet, and this is a 2050 target, but it means we need to start gradually moving more in a plant-forward direction by then if we hope to reduce the US's contribution to climate change. Okay, so that's that figure. And this is looking at dietary changes across countries. And speaking again about the Eat Lancet Planetary Health diet, that diet has been recommended as a climate-friendly and nutritionally friendly intervention for all countries around the world, considering both sustainability in terms of greenhouse gases and also nutritional adequacy. And what this figure shows is that any country along the blue scale, by adopting that sustainably friendly diet, is going to decrease its greenhouse gas emissions. And as you get more blue, the quantity of decrease increases. And as you get more red, those countries are countries that are currently nutritionally inadequate. Those are countries where they need to increase the amount of food they produce to support their populations. And in many cases, that means maybe incremental increases in certain dairy and egg products in order to reach nutritional adequacy. So those countries are actually going to have to generate more greenhouse gases to adequately feed their population. So we have to think about this in global terms and recognize that countries where decreasing is possible through dietary modification means that we have a greater burden of making this transition upon us in order to afford our global peers the opportunity to achieve adequate nutrition. And then lastly, just further emphasizing that point, this is a chart that shows the per capita meat intake by country. And as you move from progressively yellow to red, these are countries that rank far, far higher in meat consumption. So these are the countries where those opportunities for moving towards more plant-forward diets creates the greatest opportunity for us to work together to achieve reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and ideally to avoid catastrophic climate change. So anyway, I thank you for your time and look forward to taking your questions later.
Thank you, Keith. That was a terrific introduction. Okay, our next speaker is Erin Beale. Erin is the Program Officer for CLF's Food Systems Sustainability and Public Health Program. In this role, Erin coordinates research, policy, and outreach activities related to the program's 3 focus areas: reducing wasted food, supporting urban food system resilience, and connecting diet and climate change. She's currently co-teaching a graduate course at the Bloomberg School of Public Health on food system resilience to climate change and other crises. And Erin is also a Bloomberg School alum. Over to you, Erin.
Thanks, Pam. So it's really exciting to be able to speak with you all today. So you just heard from Dr. Nachman that there's some things that we can do to address climate change by changing what's on our menu. And I'm going to flip it and talk about how climate change could actually affect what we are able to eat and what is on our plate, and share some examples of some work that we're doing here at the center. So, all right, so a key way and a key thing that I've been working on is looking at how disasters, many of them that can be related to climate change events like increased severe weather and hurricanes and so on. We've been looking at how does that affect food security, in particular in the US. And so we've been looking into, well, what are the different ways that climate change could affect people's ability to get enough food that is safe, nutritious, and meets their cultural preferences. And so how do we make sure that people are food secure after any type of disaster, many of which we expect to see with more and more intensity because of climate change. So I'm just going to go through some different ways that we expect climate to affect food security, and this is globally as well as in the US, and in many ways what we're already seeing because of climate change. So the first thing is availability. So we expect that food production will change. In some places, we expect to see increased yields in food crops, for example, and other places we expect to see reduced yields because of drought and changing weather patterns, etc. So we might not be able to produce the same amounts of food because of climate change. We might also not be able to get that food from the farm to the table because of more and more disruptions in our food distribution system due to extreme weather. And there's a picture here of a semi that's trying to drive through a flood. So that's another thing that could contribute to the availability of food changing. And then we also look at food access as a key point or a key thing that's important for food security. So we could see food access changing because people are no longer able to afford it. And that could be because we have rising unemployment or we have food price spikes. We've seen the impacts of rising food prices really in different parts of the world in the last several years. And the more volatility we have in our weather patterns and in our climate, we could see more volatility in the price of food that makes it less affordable. We're also concerned about physical access to food. So again, anytime the transportation system gets disrupted by a disaster, you're also disrupting the system that is making sure food can get from the farm to the store or to our tables. And you're also affecting your ability to go to the store. And so we really have been looking especially at who are the people who might be most vulnerable to a disruption in physical food access because of a climate-related event. For example, people who are homebound and rely on others to bring food to them, or populations that may not be able to walk to a store if the roads are closed, for example. And then another key part of food security and a thing that we're thinking about in terms of impact from climate change is the acceptability of food that is available. So even if we grow enough food and we can access it, is it actually the food that we need to stay healthy and happy? So there's been some research that I think came out recently actually that looked at, or that suggested that if we have increased carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, we may actually see reduced nutrient levels in certain foods like rice. And rice is a huge staple for many people around the world. So even if we have enough food and we can get it, we might not have the same level of nutrients that we need. And then finally, there are a whole range of social and cultural preferences and things associated with what we eat that may change because we will see climate change changing migration patterns and where we live and what we can grow where we live and so on. So that's kind of how climate change could impact the food system and in particular different aspects of food security. And how do we address that? So the way that we deal with this, aside from reducing our food system's contribution to climate change, is to adapt to what we expect to see in the future. And that means building a more resilient food system that is able to withstand different severe weather events, changing weather patterns, etc. And so one of the things that we've been doing here at the CLF is working with local governments, city governments in the US to incorporate food security and food systems into their disaster preparedness planning and their climate adaptation plans and policies, and to help them think through how do we think about food when we're going into a disaster situation, and how do we make sure that making sure that food is available and accessible for our residents is a really important part of emergency response. And so we've also been seeing this a lot with the COVID-19 pandemic, and have been working with cities on thinking about food system resilience as it relates to the impacts of the pandemic, but then also what can we learn right now that can be kind of translated into longer term resilience to climate change. So now I'm going to switch gears real quick and talk about another thing that we work on that is related to climate change, and that is reducing the waste of food. And wasted food is both a contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, and it can be a result of climate-related changes. So we could see more food getting wasted because of climate change if, for example, rising temperatures mean that in areas where there isn't good refrigeration, we have food getting spoiled before people have a chance to eat it. And again, if we have disrupted food supply chains, some of that food could go to waste before it can get to consumers. But as Keith's slide showed earlier, reducing food waste is also one way that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's because about a third of the food that we produce for human consumption around the world gets wasted. So it gets left on the farm because there's nowhere to store it, or it gets wasted at the retail level, and often, as in the US, it gets wasted at the consumer level and in people's homes because we don't necessarily realize how much we might be throwing away that could be eaten. So this is a very commonly used graphic, but I really like it because it's very powerful in terms of the potential of reducing food waste for addressing climate change. And so according to the graphic from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, if food wastage were a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter. And that's saying if you take all of the food that's wasted around the world and put it into its own category and look at the emissions from that, that's where it would stand in the rankings of country rankings. So it's just behind China and the US. And an important thing to think about with food waste emissions is, so greenhouse gas emissions come from food waste in a couple of ways. The one you might think about is food that goes to a landfill, decomposes in the landfill, and it emits methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas And so that's a key way where we get emissions from food waste. But also, if you think about it, all of the food that we throw away took a lot of work and a lot of resources to grow the food, to transport it, to process it, package it, put it on store shelves. Like, if you think of all of the greenhouse gas emissions that go into getting that food from the farm to a table or to a grocery store, and then that food gets thrown away and not eaten, it's kind of like wasting emissions that, we have an emissions budget. And so we're using up a budget for something that we don't even end up eating. So there's a lot of emissions embedded in the food that we throw away. So what can we do about it? So in the US, the Environmental Protection Agency kind of adapted the reduce, reuse, recycle graphic that I'm sure you're familiar with, and came up with the food recovery hierarchy. And basically this is saying, from an environmental perspective, the most preferred way to reduce the impact of wasted food on the environment is to just prevent it from getting wasted in the first place, right? So if we're producing too many apples for a community and those apples are going to waste, the best thing to do is to just stop producing too many apples. The next thing to do, if you can't stop producing that many, would be to donate those apples to people who are hungry or food insecure. You could give them to your animals. There could be industrial uses for it, and then you could compost that apple. But the preferred way is not to compost surplus food from an environmental perspective. It's really to address things from the start. And so one of our colleagues at the Center for Livable Future, Ronnie Neff, was recently on a National Academies of Sciences panel where they researched consumer food waste and what the drivers of that waste is. And they came up with a national strategy to reduce food waste at the consumer level. And there were just three kind of overarching pathways that they recommended for how to address this problem. The first one was, this is consumer food waste, but it's not all the fault of the consumer. There are a lot of things in our environment that determine what food we eat and when we throw it away. So the first thing was change the food environment. An example of doing that could be to make sure that the date labels on your food are the same between states. It's all different across states. And so there's legislation that's in the works to make it clearer what that use by and sell by date means, so that people aren't throwing things away that are actually still safe to eat. And then another recommendation is to strengthen the motivation of consumers and their abilities and opportunities to reduce waste, primarily through behavior change campaigns. So the National Resources Defense Council and the Ad Council, for example, have been doing a Save the Food campaign. So you may have seen some of these billboards and posters around the country talking about how much Americans waste every year, and sharing tips on what people can do in their home to reduce waste. And then there are a number of technological ways that could be researched and developed to just make it more convenient not to waste food. For example, by changing portion sizes in our packaging to more accurately reflect what we want to pull out of the freezer and eat for one meal. So there are a number of things that we can do to address food waste, and in doing so, also work to address climate change. So thank you very much. That's just a rapid look at some of the things that we're working on, and I will pass it on to my colleagues.
Thank you, Erin. That was terrific. Okay, next up is Karen Basserov. Karen is a senior program officer with CLF. Her work focuses on understanding the interactions between the built environment, food access, policy, and collaboration in shaping community food systems. Karen spends most of her time at CLF on the Food Policy Networks project, working to build the capacity of food policy councils and similar organizations to effectively engage in food systems policy change. Karen has a master's degree in community and regional planning and public policy, and has worked for over a decade on food system programs and policy.
Thanks, Pam.
Take it away, Karen.
Will do. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to step in a little bit to what we're doing in terms of working with communities to address some of their food systems needs. It's a little bit less on the research side and a little bit more kind of on actions that communities can take and what we're seeing across the nation in terms of how those communities are stepping up to address climate change and working to change their food system. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background. In 1982, the city of Knoxville, Tennessee, lit the spark for a national network of community-driven collaborations for food systems change. Taking to heart the recommendation from the University of Tennessee Graduate School of Planning class taught by Associate Professor Robert L. Wilson, the city of Knoxville formed the first food policy council in the United States. The Knoxville Food Policy Council was created to, quote, improve the quality, availability, and accessibility of food delivery systems to all citizens. And this was novel in 1982. It brought together representatives from the local government, including their Department of Community and Economic Development, the Transportation Authority, and the Metro Planning Commission, along with private business owners. Almost 40 years later, this original idea of a food policy council lives on in the current iteration of the Knoxville Food Policy Council and the 287 other food policy councils across the United States. So what exactly is a food policy council? A food policy council is an organized group of stakeholders that may be sanctioned by a government body or may exist independent of government, which works to address food systems issues and needs at the local, state, regional, or tribal levels of government through policy. Not all groups are called food policy councils. They can take on a variety of names. They're called food councils, food and farm alliances. They can be a task force, a working group. The word policy isn't necessarily always used in the name of councils. Policy can be loaded with many negative assumptions about government, from bureaucracy to regulation to limiting freedom. So councils choose their name depending on the context of the community and the reception by the community. Interest in food policy councils has increased over the past decade because of their approach of bringing together people to work on community-based long-term solutions to food systems issues. Food systems issues, as you've heard from Dr. Nachman and Aaron, they're complex and they're also interdependent. So this complexity requires bringing people together with different expertise and experiences, because one organization alone is not going to solve the problem of food insecurity. Also, there is no single department of government that handles all things related to the food system. So working across a food system is a new area of work for local government, and many may not have the resources or expertise to address the problem. So they're looking to the community to help them in terms of identifying what the problems are and what the solutions they can bring forward are. Through the work of food policy councils, communities are able to build and share an understanding of the food system and the problems that face their community, as well as work on integrated solutions that are appropriate for their community. These groups tend to work on solutions to build the infrastructure that supports sustainable and resilient food systems. They do this by advocating for policy changes or funding investments in infrastructure for sustainable food systems, by educating the community about what a food system is, what the issues are facing it, and what are potential solutions, by conducting research on their community food system, and by building partnerships with organizations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about two examples of councils on the West and East Coasts that are addressing climate change through their work. The first one is the San Diego Food Systems Alliance in California. This food council began in 2012, and it's a nonprofit organization. This council is really working directly on the issue of fighting climate change through their work. They've been developing a food vision for 2030. And their three goals for this food vision are to cultivate justice, fight climate change, and build resilience. This vision for their community was built with the input of 2,200 community members who shared their needs and aspirations for their community of San Diego. Included in this strategy is included in this plan are strategies to preserve agricultural land and soil, to increase the viability of local farms, to scale up equitable food value chains, to scale up food waste, prevention, recovery, and recycling initiatives, and to plan for resilient food systems. Through this plan, the San Diego Food Systems Alliance is working on a couple of projects in order to start to address climate change. One is the Save the Food San Diego Eco Challenge, where they have worked with close to 900 participants to weigh, record, and track their household food waste over a period of 18 months. They're also working to implement the Good Food Purchasing Policy, which is a policy that institutions can implement that has 5 pillars to address where your food comes from. These include sourcing produce or food from local economies, that is nutritionally adequate, that values the workforce, meaning that it's providing the workforce with living wages, that the production practices are environmentally sustainable, and that their methods of working with animals are humane. Thus far, the Alliance has been able to successfully implement the policy with the Escondido Union School District Board of Education. It's the first institution in San Diego to be adopting the policy, and they serve 3 million meals a year to students. The Alliance also is working on a sustainable seafood project. They're conducting research on seafood availability and markets in San Diego with the hopes of seeing if there are opportunities to build a local urban market for seafood producers in the region. So hopping across the coast to the East Coast, the next council is the Rhode Island Food Policy Council. This is a state level group. They've been in existence since 2011. They're housed in a nonprofit, but they have very strong ties to the local government. Rhode Island in 2017, through work with their governor, implemented a Rhode Island food strategy called Relish Rhode. And on the screen are the 5 goals for this plan. The Rhode Island Food Policy Council has been working to implement many of the goals and pillars of this strategy for the state. One way they're doing this is by focusing on food jobs and increasing opportunities for living wage jobs for food industry workers in the state. They also have a project to increase opportunities for local seafood processing for the commercial fishing industry. And they're doing this by trying to garner investment and funding in infrastructure for local seafood producers. And lastly, they've been working with the state on a grant program that is a private-public partnership with 3 private foundations and matched with state funding to provide grants to young and beginning producers and seafood producers across the state. These are just 2 examples of the 287 groups across the US that are doing work in their communities to build their food systems infrastructure. Since 2013, the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future has hosted the only national project that explicitly supports the development of effective state and local food policy through food policy councils. The Food Policy Networks project provides networking, capacity building, research, and technical assistance to councils working to improve their food system through public policy. We host an online directory of all the food policy councils across the United States. And if you're interested, I encourage you to visit this online directory to connect with a council that's in your community or state. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, our final talk will be given by Becky Ramsey. Becky's a registered dietitian and a senior program officer at CLF, where she oversees research, communication, evaluation, and programming to facilitate a shift towards sustainable, healthy diets. Easy, right, Becky? She is also responsible for managing the center's science advisory role with the Global Meatless Monday campaign. And just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A, and we'll be doing the Q&A session after Becky's talk. Thanks.
Thanks, Pam. I'm assuming you can see my whole slide. Great. Thanks. It's really nice to be here. I'm going to wrap this up. I do a little bit of research and a little bit of practice. So hopefully just tying everything together today, just that my colleagues have presented. Okay, so as we learned from Key, Dr. Nachman, that reducing the amount of meat we consume.
Hey, Becky, I'm going to interrupt you real quick because we're seeing your next slide and your notes.
Oh yeah, that's what we need to. That's what I had asked. I'll swap displays.
Okay.
Better?
Yeah, that's it. That's right.
But,
okay. Sorry about that. Thanks.
All right. As we learned from Keith, reducing the amount of meat we consume is particularly important because of the disproportionate contribution of meat and also dairy on environmental indicators. Together, meat and dairy have an oversized impact on land use, greenhouse gas emissions, and fresh water, yet they only provide about 18% of the calories and 35% of protein globally. We know from other assessments that beef in particular has the largest contribution. This is not to say that beef should be eliminated, as we've said, but there's a clear need to right-size its contribution. We also know that diets higher in plant-based foods and lower in red and processed meats are associated with better health outcomes, especially in the United States and higher income countries. Studies have found lower rates of diabetes, heart disease, and overall mortality when red and processed meats are replaced with nuts, legumes, whole grains, low-fat dairy, and fish. Another recent study followed over 120,000 people for 20 years and recorded weight changes every 4 years. They categorized food groups and the frequency that people ate them. People who gained more weight ate more red and processed meats in addition to refined grains, sugars, sugar-sweetened beverages, fried foods, and alcohol. People who gained less weight ate more vegetables, nuts, whole grains, whole fruits, and yogurts. So a healthy diet is not just about removing one food, but about a pattern of healthy and nutritious choices. We often use the term sustainable diets to encompass eating patterns that have low environmental impacts, but also contribute to food and nutritional security and to healthy lives for present and future generations. As we learned earlier in this panel, the challenge of achieving sustainable diets for all is complex, and it involves pursuing policies and programs that are good for health and the environment, but also affordable, accessible, and culturally relevant. This is a lot. And we must work across all sectors, policy, industry, and agriculture, and also with individuals, consumers, and their food environments. To promote more sustainable diets, we need to ensure that dietary guidelines reflect sustainability principles. We need to work for a shift toward plant-centric diets, which is crucial for climate change mitigation, like whole grains, more vegetables, legumes, and nuts, fewer highly processed foods, sugars, salts, and especially processed meats, and much less meat, especially red and processed meats. And the countries with largest footprints like ours have a greater responsibility for these dietary shifts. So helping individuals as well as institutions to shift what they eat is not as easy as we all know. So meat consumption specifically has many cultural, health, and social drivers. One action or movement that has gained in recognition since 2003 is the Meatless Monday campaign. The Center for Livable Future serves as the science advisor to Meatless Monday. The campaign encourages people to go without meat one day a week for personal health and the health of the planet. It actually started to address the health impacts of high meat consumption and was modeled after the meatless days promoted by the government in World War I and World War II as patriotic actions to save resources for the troops. Today, Meatless Monday is a simple first step toward a more sustainable and healthy diet, and it's very doable. Many institutions, restaurants, celebrities, and bloggers have also taken on Meatless Monday, so a collective energy often builds around this movement. In fact, it's one of the most hashtagged health campaigns with over 4 billion social media impressions in 2019 alone. Many rightly point out that a meatless day is only a small change and won't be enough, but we argue that a small change can be more powerful and long-lasting than a big behavior change, which tends not to last, especially when we adopt it across many individuals and groups, as this slide shows. As you can see, only a small percentages of Americans are vegans and vegetarians, but together the impact is equivalent to about 30% of the population doing Meatless Monday, skipping meat one day a week. And if half of Americans would do Meatless Monday, the impact would almost double. So it's not necessarily realistic or desirable for everyone in the world to go vegan. We can still make substantial impacts from moderate dietary shifts, particularly if red meat is limited and we get more people to do it to increase the impact. In a 2015 survey of those who ate less meat over the previous years, 32% ate less by cutting meat out of their diet one day a week, 43% eliminated it from one meal, 56% from eating smaller portions, 66% from buying less meat, and only about 8% cut out meat completely. These results suggest that people are more receptive to smaller changes than eliminating something altogether. Another interesting study surveyed successful and unsuccessful vegetarians. They found that those who changed gradually were more successful. Also, those who had multiple reasons for becoming vegetarians had longer term maintenance. And interestingly, Former vegetarians, the people who stopped being vegetarians, still ate a lot less meat than the US population. So again, this emphasis on reduction versus a pure diet is more effective in decreasing overall animal production consumption and for just messaging. We also have data from multiple surveys that the primary reason for eating less meat or wanting to is most commonly health. Cost and taste are also important drivers. However, environment and animal welfare are less common motivating factors. Much of this could be due to a low awareness about the environmental impact of meat, and this is changing, but it follows many theories of behavior change that interpersonal factors are more important drivers of change. Also notable from Meatless Monday consumers surveys is that people who are aware of Meatless Monday and practice it even occasionally make other changes, such as purchasing less meat overall, trying meatless dishes when eating out, eating meatless meals on other days of the week, eating more vegetables, or just eating less meat overall. So as we look ahead and explore how best to communicate the important and urgent need for change across our food system, we see many opportunities in front of us. There is a growing interest and acceptability of meat alternatives, not necessarily avoiding meat completely, but we do need to keep emphasizing healthy substitutions, nutritious and balanced food choices. Menus at restaurants and food products are also changing, with more plant-based ingredients becoming common. There's more culinary creativity around plant-based ingredients in global menus. And with climate change moving to a policy forefront now, we have an opportunity to include food in the conversation, and at the same time ensure an equity lens that emphasizes healthy food access. The good news is that your plate can also be part of the solution. So we are looking forward to joining with you as we continue this good work for a healthy, sustainable, equitable, and just food system for all. Thanks, that's all I have.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks to everybody. Okay, we're gonna jump to Q&A. We had a couple of good questions here. I'm gonna start with the first one that was posted by an anonymous attendee. It's very similar to the question that I was gonna start with, but since it's so similar, we're just gonna jump right to the participant's question. Can you, and this would be directed to everyone, can you comment on Fox News' reaction to one food science article on the topic you presented and the allegations that Biden's plan limits the consumption of red meat? And I'll add to that, the news and the rumors on social media were that Biden was planning to limit people to 4 pounds of meat per person per year, which clearly his climate plan does not do that. It looks like a serious indicator that there would not be support for government involvement to regulate those CO2 emissions. How do you suggest to go about influencing public opinion and consumers' taste in this country? And would anyone trust the authenticity and good faith of food-related campaigns? Who wants to take that on first? Okay, Keith.
I'm happy to start, and hopefully my kids will be quiet while I do it. So no, I watched this whole thing unravel. It was really kind of entertaining. So this, to my knowledge, originated with a story in a conservative UK paper called the Daily Mail that fabricated a component of the Biden climate plan and based it on a paper that came out a year before Biden was elected president that modeled the impact of 4 kilograms of beef in the annual diet to see what emissions would look like under that particular scenario. So this really has no anchor to anything that Biden is planning to do. That said, I think the other component of the question is really interesting. In light of the response to that erroneous claim about Biden's plans and the enormous pushback those false plans received, do we have any concerns about the rollout of behavioral pushes on beef? And I think it's a reasonable question. I think the idea that we'd be limiting the amount of beef for Americans, a society that often will kind of pride itself on being a hamburgers and hot dogs kind of country, was pretty negative. But I think it's all about how the message is framed. I don't think it changes what we and other researchers have found about the need to transition away from meat-heavy diets. But I think when framed as the government is coming for your beef and putting strict restrictions on the amount you're allowed to consume, no governmental intervention that's framed in that manner is going to be met with receptivity in our country. So I think it's about government policies that make alternative dietary patterns possible, that paints some of our more plant-forward alternatives in a more positive light. I think interventions that look to entice consumers to behave responsibly are going to be much more successful than those that are framed as a penalty or a draconic kind of, you're going to have to cut this out forever. I mean, and that plays out in kind of the response we found to our research findings, that this 2/3 vegan diet that still contains other foods that are thought to be the great villains of agriculture and climate change. You can still have some of them, but you treat them kind of like Cookie Monster said, like a sometimes food. And I think everything will be okay and much more positively received.
I can add from a dietitian perspective, just in practice, what Keith is saying, I completely agree with. We need to have a positive approach to people to changing diets, and we need to be about food that tastes good. And there's a lot of people, influencers out there who can make a difference. And as I've experienced, when people try something and tastes good, they don't care if there's meat in it or not. And I've seen people make shifts because they like the food and because they knew that it was healthy for them. So there's a lot of things we can do, but I think the way we market food, the way we make food accessible, the way we work within our food systems, especially our urban systems, to grow food and healthy food. There's just so many other things we can do on the local policy and on federal policy to make healthy foods available and more desirable and tasty. And I think that's the way you can get consumers to shift. And we've seen those shifts, both negative and positive. People know that fruits and vegetables are good for them. They try to eat more. People are interested now in eating more plant-based foods because they've heard this. So if we continue that trajectory, I think we can make that difference versus, like you said, stopping, pushing down and saying you can't have something. Meatless Monday has been really successful by the promoters, not by the people who, they've found that if they go to a cafeteria and just take meat off the menu on Monday, there's usually a revolt. But if they, provide some nice, really tasty meatless specials, people will try them and enjoy them. So that's a different approach.
Thanks, guys. Erin or Karen, do you want to add anything to that?
The only thing I would add is to say that, as we look at communities and what they're doing, it's to the point of the framing. I think the framing of the campaigns makes a huge difference, but also in terms of, we've seen local government stepping up to say food and food systems, and our local producers are a big, important part of our community and our region. And so, there's a number of local governments that have passed resolutions or that have strategies or plans that are really building up, supporting and sourcing from their local producers. And some of those are meat producers, but mostly it's fruit and vegetable producers. And so having that kind of investment of their governments and their communities, I think, is helping to raise awareness. It helps people to understand kind of where their food is coming from. And I think that's a big part of understanding kind of how our food system impacts our climate, is understanding what that system looks like, where our food comes from as a first step, and then kind of figuring out how that impacts our environment as well.
I think they answered it pretty well, and it looks like we have some other questions. So
okay, thank you, guys. Okay, someone's asking about the emissions of dairy and whether that might be considered as part of the My Plate diagram. So I'm thinking, step back to the dietary guidelines for Americans and the science that goes into considering the sustainability. What's the latest on that?
On dairy in the dietary guidelines?
Yeah, did they, and the idea of considering carbon emissions and sustainability in the dietary guidelines. That's been an issue over the last 2 cycles.
I can start and let Keeve add the real answer, but
You might have the real answer more than me, but go ahead.
you know, dairy is much more of a conundrum than like processed and red meat is, because dairy has some important health impacts, and there's been a lot of bad press around, bad information around dairy, but actually dairy is shown to be important, especially in children, and globally. It's a very affordable source of protein and nutrients that children need for growth. So and for that reason, but yet it is associated with high greenhouse gas and water footprints. So you know, I think that's one of those ones that's not as clear cut, and we need to, you know, take moderation into chance, and the people who need to have the dairy should have the dairy, and you know, for those of us who don't need it as much nutritionally, we can look at alternatives, healthy alternatives, such as ones that are high in protein, like the pea protein milks or the soy milks.
Yeah, and just to add on that, over the last 2 cycles of the dietary guidelines, my understanding is that there has been a great push from the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee to consider sustainability in finalizing the dietary guidelines. And under the previous administration, there was quite a bit of pushback. And I think the ultimate guidelines were not informed by sustainability concerns the way they should have been. And so I'm hopeful, crossing my fingers, that, you know, given the new administration and the marked difference in philosophical view and commitment to paying attention to the science, I'm hopeful that sustainability becomes a major consideration in recommending what we eat as Americans. I think it's a terrific opportunity for pushing us from that baseline that I showed on the left of that one figure, closer to the right and closer to meeting some of our objectives. And I think dairy is a great opportunity for that. It's not about ending dairy. It's not about eliminating it. It's just, let's calibrate it. Let's think about who is going to benefit the most from dairy and who doesn't need as much.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? Okay, so Donald is asking about the relative average difference in temperature over the world, something like 8 to 10 degrees, which show the difference a small change could make. I'm not quite making out the question, but anybody want to try to?
Maybe Donald can restate it and make it a little bit clearer. I'm struggling with it too.
Yeah. Okay, well, Jean comes back with another question about some of the conundrums that we're having with the shift in diets that we're talking about today, with how to address the concerns of ranchers. And, you know, Keith, maybe you want to talk about the different types of meat and the way it's produced, and kind of those shifts that are generally recommended, IFAP versus pastured. And I don't think we know exactly where all of our consumption can come from in terms of a sustainable diet, but we're getting closer.
Yeah, no, Pam, and I apologize for the questioner. I didn't catch the name, but there are many differences beyond just sustainability concerns when it comes to choosing where your meat comes from, and what the different ways of sourcing meat mean for the people who are producing the meat and for the people who live in proximity. So much of our meat in the United States and much of the developed world comes from industrial food animal production operations, which are highly concentrated, designed to produce a really uniform product at a very razor thin profit margin. But it's a model that really tends to externalize a lot of costs associated with production, and the people who end up paying the price are the people who work in these operations to produce the animals, the people who live near them, the animals themselves in terms of compromised animal welfare, and the public through exposures to microbiological and chemical hazards that result from the way those animals are produced. So while I think shifting what you eat, what types of terrestrial animals, is going to have immense consequences for greenhouse gases, there are many other compelling motivations for thinking more holistically about where your meat comes from, how it's produced, and who might be affected by those production methods. So I would say, you know, ranchers who are raising their animals in a more pasture-based system provide benefits beyond those sustainability concerns, and really focused on treating the animals well and treating agricultural communities well, and ultimately the consumers well also.
Thanks, Keith. Anybody else want to jump in on that? We have one good question. I want to save some time for this, possibly our last question. Paz is asking about environmental racism and environmental justice with our food systems work. And that's huge. We could do a whole webinar just on that. But it does touch each of your work areas. So does anybody want to jump in and talk about their work in that regard?
I could start, if it's okay to talk again. There has been considerable research looking at where large-scale animal production facilities are sited and located and who lives near them. And the reason for that is, living near a concentrated animal feeding operation has been linked through epidemiologic research to an array of adverse health effects ranging from increased exposure to infectious agents, oftentimes antibiotic-resistant bacteria, odors, particulate matter that can elicit adverse respiratory outcomes, as well as other psychosocial disadvantages for people who have to contend with the reality of living near a large-scale animal production facility. And the research that has examined the location of those operations has focused largely on race, ethnicity, and income, and has found that in certain states around the world where we've actually looked, we found that these operations are by and large located in low-income communities of color. And what that translates to is that, you and I go to the grocery store and we get a pound of beef and maybe it's $5 or $6, which is really inexpensive. But we, in purchasing those inexpensive meats, are endangering the health of other people who don't have a choice, who probably don't have the social capital, the financial capital to move away and better their situations. They can't force those farms to shut down. And there's a perception of agriculture as being beneficial for all. And so I'm not trying to vilify agriculture overall, but at the same time, our current model of production really disadvantages some of our population for the benefit of much of our population. And that's an injustice that deserves more attention and intervention.
Thanks, Keith. I know that we're just about at time now, but Aaron or Karen, do you want to jump in and talk about any of the community-based work that you're doing and what you're seeing with environmental justice?
Yeah, I can just add a little bit. So especially for the food system resilience work that we're doing, we focus a lot on urban communities and urban food systems. And one of the main things that we do with the local governments we're working with is to identify what communities in their cities may be more vulnerable to different types of disasters and crises. And that often tends to be, like Keith said, there, low income communities of color where there has been systemic structural racism for many years that has led to a lot of disparities in health and disparities in healthy food access. And when you have a crisis or a disaster situation come in that makes it that much harder to access food in those communities, it could be just exponentially more difficult to maintain your ability to get enough food, for example. So that's, I think, just something that we kind of think about as we're doing the resilience work, especially in thinking about how to overcome some of those historical disparities and inequities.
So I'll add very briefly that the food policy councils and kind of across the food movement in general is grappling with kind of racial injustice in our food system. In these community-based groups, we see a lot of focus and attention being placed on how they go about kind of addressing issues of racism across the food system, not just environmental racism, but dealing with health disparities, impact on Black or farmers of color as well. It's a big question in terms of kind of how to embed equity and racial equity into policies at a local level. But we're moving into a space, especially with the councils and our work with them, of really starting to develop projects and conversations around kind of how do we take these groups that are a lot of times professionals that work in the space of food systems or public health, and build that table differently so that there are community members that are impacted by the food system in negative ways, so that they're at center of the table making decisions and advocating for changes. And so I think that also means shifting in terms of who they're working with and the partners that they bring to the table. So it's kind of racial equity in the food system, particularly with food policy councils right now, is a big interest. And so there's a lot of work that's being done, but there's not necessarily like a silver bullet answer in terms of how you address this at a community level.
Thanks, Karen. All right, well, it's time to wrap up. So thank you to all the panelists, and thanks to all the attendees for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. If you'd like to stay engaged with CLF or stay engaged on these issues, you can go to our website, which is here. If you're in the Baltimore area, we often host in-person events. Hopefully soon, we'll get back to hosting more in-person events. You can sign up for our events newsletter from our website. And we have recordings of our past events. We've hosted luminaries such as Wendell Berry and Eric Schlosser, Vandana Shiva, Ricardo Salvador, and others. We also have produced 3 short documentaries that you might be interested in that are available for free on our YouTube page. You can follow us on social media. And we have 2 free online courses on Coursera, one on just an intro to the US food system, and another that speaks to a lot of the issues that we covered today on sustainable diets. And here's, on our website, you'll find links to the Meatless Monday campaign and the food policy networks and the Resilience Project and the research that was discussed and many other resources. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of Alumni Week.